That image is far more valuable to the prosecution than any question that could have been asked, than any expert explaining what it was like, than any diagram that could have been drawn. Having that actual murder weapon, and that's what it is, sitting there in court in front of him, and having her stand over it is an image that will be etched inside of the minds of these jurors when they go in to deliberate. A Hollywood ending 30 years in the making finally reaches its dramatic final act as the LA District Attorney makes a huge announcement in the Menendez brothers murder case. Plus, so-called suitcase killer Sarah Boone finally has her moment in the spotlight as she takes the stand in her own defense. All this and more this week on Courtroom Confidential. When it comes to the true crime world, the phrase never say never sometimes takes on a very special meaning, and this week was a perfect example of that. Let's jump right in. Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon will recommend Erik and Lyle Menendez be resentenced for the 1989 killings of their parents in the family's Beverly Hills home, providing the brothers with a chance at freedom after 34 years behind bars. LA's top prosecutor announced during a press conference Thursday that he will request the brothers' prior sentence of life without the possibility of parole be rescinded and they instead be sentenced for murder. This would make them immediately eligible for parole. In 1989, Erik and Lyle Menendez bought a pair of shotguns with cash, walked into their Beverly Hills home, and shot their parents while they watched a movie in the family living room. Prosecutors said Jose Menendez was struck 5 times, including the back of the head, and Kitty Menendez crawled on the floor, wounded, before the brothers reloaded and fired a final fatal blast. The killings and the televised trial that followed has sparked documentaries, movies, and television series that have made the brothers 2 of the most publicly recognizable convicts. At the time, prosecutors argued the slayings were driven by greed and the brothers' desire to get their parents' multi-million-dollar estate. But during the trials, Erik and Lyle Menendez detailed what they said were years of violent sexual abuse at the hands of their father. The petition for resentencing was expected to be filed by the end of this week, with a hearing before a judge hopeful within the next 30 to 45 days, according to the district attorney's office. If the resentencing is granted, Erik, now 53, and Lyle, 56, would immediately become eligible for parole. All right, well, what's happening here? First off, wow. However you feel about this, it is historic. You just do not see these types of things happen, especially with a case of this much public intrigue and this much high-profile attention. But I also have to say that this is more unexpected than I thought it would be. I think that everybody saw the writing on the wall, that it was probably expected that George Gascon was going to go ahead and agree to resentencing. But I think the decision everyone had in their minds is that that was going to be between either rejecting any request or resentencing them to manslaughter. So to some extent, this is a bit of a curveball. And it's a good question to ask what is happening here, because this is how it all breaks down. He made it explicitly clear that this is a murder, and that's how the DA's office saw it and continues to see it. What made the murder back in 1989 heinous and more than just murder turned it into what we call capital murder or special circumstance murder were these allegations that are called special circumstances in California. If you commit a first-degree murder and there are special circumstances attached to that, things like lying in wait, things like murder for financial gain, multiple murder, murder during torture, things like that, murder during certain enumerated felonies, it can make that murder eligible for special circumstances and therefore eligible for the death penalty or life without parole. But that is a decision that the DA's office can make. They can charge a murder that has special circumstance elements, not as a special circumstance murder. And they do that all the time. And so essentially what he's saying is, I'm going to use my power as the DA to say, not that this isn't murder, but that I'm going to remove the special circumstances from it. And by doing so, their sentence of life without any possibility of parole now becomes life with the possibility of parole. Added to that is this sentencing wrinkle where if the murder was committed while the defendant, or defendants in this case, were below the age of 26, Lyle was 21 and Erik was 18, it makes them eligible before that, what would be 50 years to life they would see. 25 to life for each of the murders. So 25 plus 25, 50 to life, that's what they would normally be looking at. But now he's saying, based upon their age at the time, based upon the fact that I'm removing the special circumstances, they now become immediately eligible for parole. This is interesting because, and I gotta say, to some extent, it's smart for Gascon. If this is what you wanted to do, and you're in Gascon's position, and you wanted to do something like this, this is a smart political move. And I think that politics absolutely played a role in all of this. I know that there are people listening and watching this episode right now who are very much against any decision to let these men out. They believe that the crimes were heinous, that they were committed for financial gain, and that these two men are just playing the system. And I can understand that position. There are also people listening to this who think, no, they were the victims of abuse. They've done enough time. We need to look at this whole case differently. And Gascon has actually found a clever way to split the baby. He's saying it is murder. It is awful. They should be held accountable for murder. But I'm going to use my discretion to take a look at this and say that it's not a special circumstance murder. I'm not going to dismantle the jury verdict. They're still guilty of murder, but I'm also going to give them the opportunity at parole. And what's interesting about that too is that it takes the decision to release them and puts it in somebody else's hands as well. So just so we all understand how this is going to play out, Gascon is going to file this week, his office, a petition to the court to have them resentenced. To have them resentenced to, for lack of a better term, garden variety first-degree murder. Murder without special circumstances. That will have to be placed on a court calendar. It will go back to the same trial court. It's not going to be the same judge. That judge has long since left the bench. It will be placed on a court's calendar. That judge will either set immediately a hearing or set a hearing setting date, ask for them to submit whatever briefs. There are going to be briefs in opposition to this. We call those amicus briefs, briefs filed by people who are not the defense or the prosecution, but interested parties. Not all of the family members were on board with this decision. They're going to oppose this, and there will be a hearing. And a judge will have to make the decision. So end of the day, a judge was going to have to make the decision anyways. But now a judge will make a decision, but that decision won't then lead to the immediate release of Erik and Lyle. That decision will just make them eligible for parole. And then it goes to a parole board to make their decision. Now, will the parole board immediately decide to parole them? I don't know. The parole board in California has been, as of late, favorable towards granting parole, but they don't always grant parole on the first request for parole. But what it does, what I'm saying, the point I'm making is strategically from Gascon's perspective, you can't point to him and say that he's the ones that actually, quote unquote, released them. He just created the mechanism by which someone else can release them. It's interesting. It's fascinating. I realize that there are a lot of other issues here at play. From a historical perspective, I think it's worth talking about. But this is also one of those cases that 30 years later, we're still talking about it. 30 years later, people still feel very strongly about this. 30 years later, I can still talk myself in circles about this case. To one extent, I say, you know what? I do believe there was evidence that abuse was taking place in that home. I do believe they should have been entitled to a imperfect self-defense instruction. I do believe they should have been entitled to at least have the option of manslaughter available to the jury. By the way, if you really want to get into the weeds of all the legal issues on this case, we did a 5 Things You Need to Know episode on this. Please go check it out. But then I also take a look at it and I go, they shotgunned their parents to death. Their parents weren't in the midst of abusing them. They were in no immediate peril. They shotgunned them to death as they were watching television and according to some accounts, eating strawberries and cream. And they shotgunned to death their mother, not the person who allegedly was causing all of this abuse. Perhaps a person who should have known better, should have done more, but they shotgunned her to death. They reloaded. They had to leave the room, put in more shotgun shells, go back and put one more in the side of that woman's head. That's also incredibly heinous. So maybe at the end of the day, considering all of that, and this is what makes a prosecutor's job so difficult, maybe end of the day, considering all of that, this could have been the right decision. First degree murder, 25 to life for each murder, but with the option of parole being available to them someday in the future. So there's a very real likelihood that one day we could see Erik and Lyle Menendez walking out of prison. And what do you guys think about that? Do you think this is a miscarriage of justice, or do you think it was the right thing to do as we sit here in 2024? Please let us know in the comments. The Florida woman accused of leaving her boyfriend trapped in a zipped suitcase to die testified they both found it funny he could fit inside, but that she felt too scared to let him out when he turned angry during his final moments of life. Sarah Boone took the stand in her murder trial this week to portray the gruesome 2020 death of Jorge Torres Jr. as an unexpected tragedy from an innocent, drunken game of hide and seek. "We were laughing about it," Boone told the jury, "and it was just strange that he was small enough to fit in there. And then I kind of moved it around a little bit with him in the suitcase still." Boone then said the case fell over and she started videotaping it. She told the court she wanted to use the opportunity to talk to Torres, since he was not able to get out. Footage shows Torres thrashing about inside the suitcase, telling her, "I can't effing breathe," as she yells back at him. Boone took 2 clips of her laughing at Torres as he begged for his life. She can be heard saying, "For everything you've done to me, F you, stupid." Boone continued, "His hand started to come through, so I shook the suitcase to try to get his hand to go back in, telling him, 'Please stop doing this to me.' Adding later, I grabbed the baseball bat to poke his hand to go in, so I hit his hand." Boone claimed that she got terrified when the still-trapped Torres, whom she now accuses of previous domestic violence, started threatening her to release him. When asked what would happen if Torres were able to get out of the suitcase, Boone responded that she believed he would kill her, adding, "He used to tell me he would have left me unrecognizable and I would have lost my life." What's happening here? First off, there is no getting around this. As far as Boone and her defense team are concerned, this was mission accomplished. They did everything that they needed to do with this testimony. They needed to explain the videos, and they did. They needed to explain the injuries on Torres, and they did. And they needed to establish an overt act. Now, you may not agree with the strength of all of those, but as far as what they needed to accomplish with her testimony, they accomplished those things. And the most important thing they did, the game changer in this entire case for them, was establishing that overt act. You remember that there was argument about whether or not they would even be allowed to argue self-defense or battered spouse syndrome. The judge decided that as long as they could establish an overt act, meaning some act that Torres took, something he did, you can't just go into a case and say, "I was defending myself. This was self-defense," when there was nothing done by the victim to provoke that response by you. So as long as they were able to establish this overt act, and the law uses the word a scintilla of evidence, meaning a light dusting of evidence, as long as there was some showing of evidence that he made some overt act, and that was established by his hand getting out of that suitcase and threatening her, according to her, then this case is wide open from the defense perspective. They are allowed to get into self-defense. They are allowed to get an instruction on self-defense. They are allowed to present predicate acts of battered spouse syndrome. They are allowed to have experts testify, and that's what they have done for the remainder of the week. The defense case went from her testifying, and that's about it, to her testifying plus a bunch of experts, plus instructions, plus all these arguments that they can make to the jury. Now, That's the good side of what they did. But there were obviously some glaring problems with her testimony. First of all, according to her, all of this occurred. The threats, the trying to get out, the hitting him with the baseball bat, the being in fear for her life. In the 11 minutes between those two cell phone videotapes that are now so famous, there were two videos that were taken. In both of them, she's mocking him, and in both of them, he's asking and pleading to be let out because he can't breathe. But in those 11 minutes, even according to their opening statement, that is where the entire secret of the case, the key to unlock this entire case, lay in those 11 minutes. But she also testified she doesn't even remember taking the videos. So how possibly can she be relied upon to tell us what is taking place in the 11 minutes between those two videos? And isn't it really convenient that the most pivotal part of this entire case happens to take place in those 11 unrecorded minutes? Isn't it just a little too convenient that the whole crux of the defense case happens to be unrecorded? She's recording him as he's begging for his life. She's recording him as she's mocking him and laughing at this man as he's dying inside of that suitcase, but she's not recording when he's making the threats against her. Secondly, the reason why I feel like her testimony fails is it doesn't really explain to us why after all of this, after the baseball bat, after all of this fear, after the taunting him, why does she go to bed? What decision took place in this roller coaster of emotions? How did we land on, but then I just went to bed? I grabbed my glass of Chardonnay, I took my dogs, I went upstairs and I went to bed. This maniac who she's so afraid of is going to burst out of that suitcase at any moment, is still laying there inside of the suitcase, and she simply goes to bed? Or is a far more reasonable explanation that she simply did not care if he lived or died? And if he was trapped inside of that thing all night long for 11 hours, then so be it. Now, on cross, I was not all that impressed, but that's fine. Cross isn't always going to be home runs all over the place. But one thing the prosecutor did do extremely well, and I was proud of and I applauded it, was asking her to demonstrate with that suitcase how exactly she zipped him up. This was great for several reasons. The big two that stick out in my mind are, you can have that suitcase in court. You can show the people, the jurors, photographs of it. You can talk about the dimensions of it. But until you have that laying on the floor in front of them, with her standing over it, only then does it really come to life. Only then does it really have the effect on your brain as to what the final moments of this man's life was like. That image is far more valuable to the prosecution than any question that could have been asked, than any expert explaining what it was like, than any diagram that could have been drawn. Having that actual murder weapon, and that's what it is, sitting there in court in front of him, and having her stand over it, is an image that will be etched inside of the minds of these jurors when they go in to deliberate. And the other thing that took place, and perhaps this was just serendipity, or perhaps he knew it all along, but she had incredible trouble zipping that suitcase up. She was struggling to get the zip. The prosecutor and the defense attorney were all on their knees at one point trying to zip this thing shut. And she claims that she left him because he was in no danger, because she felt like he would be able to get himself out of it anyways. That to me was the unspoken testimony in all of that, was that seeing how those zippers were difficult to move, that man was in a death trap, and he stayed there for nearly 11 hours as he slowly suffocated to death. Each breath less than the last, until that man hopefully, prayerfully lost consciousness before he eventually died. That is the image that's going to stick with these jurors. I don't care what expert tells them about battered spouse syndrome and about how it affects someone. they're going to have the image of that suitcase on the floor with a man inside of it slowly suffocating to death in their minds when they go back to deliberate. Now, that's not to say that the defense has not been doing an admirable job. And have they been creating questions about battered spouse syndrome and how that may have played a role in this case? And do those questions rise to the level of reasonable doubt? That is the question that I have for you. Please tell us what you think. How is this case all playing out in your minds? Please let us know in the comments. Before we dive into the other cases making headlines this week, please take a quick second to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We are really touched by the positive response that we have received from all of you, and we look forward to providing you with more and more content every week. And you subscribing is what makes that all possible. And don't forget to check out Courtroom Confidential as a podcast. Please join our community on all major podcast platforms. Also making headlines this week, images of the gruesome wounds sustained by Libby German and Abby Williams were displayed in court during the Delphi murder trial on Wednesday. As the high-profile trial of Richard Allen for the gruesome murders of 2 Indiana teens entered its second week, jurors were visibly stricken as forensic pathologist Dr. Roland Kaur testified regarding the autopsies he had conducted on both girls. This marked the first time any details of the girls' injuries and cause of death had been made public. Pictures of both girls' gaping neck wounds were displayed on a large screen placed directly in front of the jurors. According to courtroom observers, one man put his head in his hands, breathed deeply, and reddened. Behind him, a woman put her hand over her mouth. Earlier, jurors heard from a final eyewitness, Sarah Carbaugh, who told the court she had seen a bloody and muddy man fitting Bridge Guy's description, referring to the man infamously captured on a video recovered from Libby's phone, walking away from Onan High Bridge Trail around 4 p.m. the day the girls went missing. When challenged over the consistency of her recollection, transcripts of her 3 interviews with law enforcement show she did not mention blood until a 2019 interview. Carbaugh insisted she had always mentioned both mud and blood. In an increasingly ill-tempered exchange with defense attorney Andrew Baldwin, Carbaugh snapped, "I saw Bridgeman walking along the road. He was covered in mud and blood, and that's that." Trial is expected to last for several more weeks. Allen faces a maximum sentence of 130 years in prison if convicted. The second week of testimony continued in the Leilani Simon murder trial as prosecutors intend to prove the Georgia mother killed her toddler son Quentin in October 2022. On October 5th of 2022, Simon called the police to report that her 20-month-old son was missing. She told a 911 operator that the front door was open and Quentin must have been abducted. For weeks, investigators searched for the boy. His remains were discovered on November 18th. Prosecutors now believe Leilani killed Quentin on the morning of October 5th by assaulting him with an unknown object before leaving the boy in a dumpster outside of a trailer park near her home. Week 2 of testimony opened with 3 witnesses from various FBI field offices, including FBI Special Agent Brad Snyder, who conducted numerous preliminary interviews with Leilani Simon, her brother Paul, and her boyfriend Daniel Youngkin. When pressed as to why Leilani became their prime suspect, Snyder responded, "Ultimately, there were 3 individuals in that house, 3 adults in that house. Of those 3 adults, there was only one that continued to lie to us throughout the course of the investigation." The jury has now heard from 26 witnesses of the 40-plus witnesses that are expected to take the stand. The murder trial of Melody Farris, accused of killing her husband Gary Farris and burning his body on their Cherokee County property, also continued this week with testimony from their daughter Emily Farris. Melody Farris faces charges of malice murder for allegedly shooting her husband and attempting to dispose of his body in a burn pile on their rural home in 2018. Emily Farris testified that the breakdown in her parents' marriage following an affair her mother had with a man named Ted Y. in 2009. According to Emily, the relationship never fully recovered despite her father's efforts to reconcile. The testimony painted a picture of a family strained by financial and emotional turmoil, as Emily recalled her mother's influence over family decisions and financial control, despite being removed from joint bank accounts after the affair. Trial is expected to continue into next week. The judge in Ashley Benefield's case is considering the defense motion for a new trial following allegations of juror misconduct, including allegations of a juror not truthfully answering a question and the potential use of a cell phone during deliberation. Ashley Benefield did not appear in court Monday. Following her conviction of manslaughter in the 2020 shooting of her husband, Doug, she is awaiting sentencing. Benefield claims self-defense and used Florida's standard ground defense. Initially charged with second-degree murder, Benefield was found guilty of a lesser charge. Jurors were brought back and interviewed regarding the misconduct allegations. During arguments on Monday, the conversation centered around a juror who may have not answered a question correctly or truthfully on the juror's questionnaire. The juror is alleged to have not disclosed information related to domestic violence in her life. Benefield was originally scheduled to be sentenced on Tuesday. However, Judge White said he isn't sure how to rule on the potential misconduct issue and wants to take the matter under consideration before ruling. The judge added he will consult with prosecutors and the defense before setting a new date. Ashley Benefield is facing 11 to 30 years in prison. A Miami social media model accused of fatally stabbing her boyfriend in 2022 was back in court last Friday as her attorney sought to have her released on bond. 28-year-old Courtney Clenney is facing a second-degree murder charge in the April 2022 stabbing death of her boyfriend, 27-year-old Christian Obumsele, at the couple's Edgewater condo. Clenney has remained jailed without bond since the time of her arrest. During Friday's hearing, her attorneys argued that she should be released based upon the plausibility of her self-defense claim. Clenney reportedly told police that she threw the knife at Obumsele in self-defense while tried to get away, and that she did not stab him at close range. To support this, a forensic pathologist expert was called to show a knife-throwing demonstration they set up that involved an expert knife thrower tossing knives at a pig carcass. Prosecutors urged Judge Laura Cruz to deny the defense request, saying that Clenney represents a danger to herself and everyone else around her whenever she doesn't get her way. The judge indicated that she would issue her ruling at a later date. Before we get to what's on the docket for next week, I want to take a moment to thank you all for your support. The love from our growing community has been absolutely amazing. But we want to give a very special shout out to M.I. Godis for their glowing review on Apple Podcasts, and to our new members, Pamela H. Happy Vibes and Linda McCoff, for their kind words on YouTube. Keep them coming, folks. We highly appreciate your feedback. On the docket next week, an Orange County judge accused of shooting and killing his wife will be back in court on November 1st to set a date for his trial. Judge Jeffrey Ferguson recently had his bail revoked by Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Eleanor Hunter after it was determined he had consumed alcohol in violation of his bail conditions. Finally, Grisly True Crime was launched on YouTube by Gisela K in June of 2021 and has since grown to a community of over 250,000 devoted subscribers who call themselves Grizzlies. Please join me this Monday for the first in our new Courtroom Confidential Conversation series. I sat down with Gisela to discuss growing up in South Africa, working as a commercial airline pilot, and her journey from a true crime author to podcaster, and finally to hosting one of the most popular true crime channels on YouTube. Join us in the chat for a live premiere this Monday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. That is it for us this week, folks. I am your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. Thank you again for joining me. Have a great weekend, and I will see you again next week for another episode of Courtroom Confidential.